Hello everyone, welcome to the channel Ontario Law and the Older Person, and this video is the second of two about a report called Perspectives on Growing Older in Canada. And it is not about the law per se, but it is about how older people feel about their own experiences. The information provided in this video is not legal advice. It is relayed for the purposes of general information. No legal decision should be made based on this material. Any viewer who needs legal advice should contact a lawyer. So this is the first page of the report. It is by the National Institute on Aging. So the entire title, Perspectives on Growing Older in Canada, the 2025 NIA Aging in Canada Survey, and the link is in the description. Here are the list of writers. This is the same information I provided in the first video, but in case you didn't watch that one, I want to make it clear that it's important to know whenever there is a survey or a study, who were the participants in that study? Who was being asked questions? So this is the information we're given from this report. It involves 6,001 Canadians aged 50 plus living in community settings across all provinces and territories. People excluded from this study, people living in institutions. That would include people living in long-term care facilities, people who are stuck in hospitals for a serious period of time, possibly retirement homes, and I have expressed in other areas my frustration with how frequently people living in institutions are left out of studies like these. I suspect a lot of people who are living in long-term care facilities would have different kinds of answers, and I do find it problematic that they are so often left out of the discussion. I think that's something that should be changed. Now, the writers provide a reason for this exclusion. Most people want to age in community settings. And I don't think that's a good enough reason to be leaving people out just because they didn't get to age in community settings. And sure, most people want to age at home, but they don't necessarily have that option. I think these people should still be part of these studies. Now, while the document states people of the territories were included in the study, the sample was so small that the writers couldn't really make any firm conclusions on those people's experiences. And people in territories are often left out of these studies. And in this case, while the percentage of people from territories compared to this overall sample might be similar to the percentage of people living in the territories when it comes to the entire Canadian population, do you feel researchers should in fact go out of their way to include more stories from the territories? I think they should. This is a direct quote. As respondents were drawn from an opt-in online panel rather than a random probability frame, results cannot be considered statistically generalizable in the same way as a true probability sample. Due to the approach of the study, participants were largely limited to those with access to and comfort with using the internet. So we have access to resources that might be a barrier to participating in a study like this. And a couple of categories that I sliced out from a chart that talks about a lot of different characteristics. I just wanted to focus on these two. First of all, far more people in this study own homes as opposed to rent, and income has a big impact on the experiences anyone has, but we're focusing on older people. And then when we're looking at ethnicity, by far the majority are white. And then others, we've got a whole bunch of different ethnicities that would have been clumped together, even though different ethnicities have very different experiences. So I think this sample is problematic. So something to keep in mind as we go through the material is that, only certain people are part of this study. That's going to have an impact on the results. Another issue is that no participants were identified as being part of the LGBTQ community. And as you can imagine, older people who are part of that community have different experiences from those who aren't. This is an issue that I will be raising in other videos. And then the discussion appears to have been based on the premise that the population is binary, divided into men and women. Again, that will be hopefully stuff I can address in other videos. Here are the National Institute on Aging's 10 indicators of aging well in Canada. So under social well-being, they have social network and strength, social engagement, experienced ageism. And then under financial security, they have income adequacy, material deprivation, and retirement readiness. And I addressed those in the first video. The remainder, which I will address in this video, health and independence. So under that category, access to healthcare, access to home and community-based care, aging in the right place. And then 10, overall experience of aging in Canada. All right, this is going to be a long video and we're going to be using a lot of statistics. So hopefully it's not too dry, you lose interest. So here's a direct quote. In 2025, 68% of Canadians 50 years plus reported having a regular primary care provider, such as a family physician or nurse practitioner. And that is a very disturbingly low amount. And I don't know if you remember, this happened a few years ago where this woman in British Columbia actually took out an ad desperate for a doctor to take on her and her husband. Her husband had prescriptions and they couldn't find anyone to give him renewed prescriptions. And so she was able to get a doctor that way, but obviously we have some really desperate circumstances and this is disturbing. Okay, then 76% of those 80 plus had primary care providers, while 50 to 64 had 64%. And then it says women reported higher rates than men, 70% versus 66%. And as I said in the first video, with this information, I would have loved to have seen a little more elaboration. Why are these things happening? Why are older people having more access to this kind of care than younger people? With women reporting higher rates than men, is that possibly because women just tend to access healthcare more often than men do? We've read a lot of stuff in other sources where that is a possibility that is suggested. And like the first video, I'm not going to be doing research in order to evaluate what's in this report because that would take forever. But again and again, they're giving us information without supporting explanation. And I really wish there was that additional information in this report. Anyways, moving on. Only 53% of older adults in Prince Edward Island reported having a regular primary care provider compared to 72% in Manitoba and 71% in Saskatchewan. And again, why is that? Is it just that there are fewer resources involving health in these different areas? It would be nice to know. In 2025, 86% of Canadians 50 plus reported needing healthcare services or treatments in the past year. This is consistent with 87% in 2024 and 86% in 2023, and notably higher than 80% in 2022. Maybe there's some events that are happening in Canada that could be increasing this need. While need is widespread across older adults, it grows steadily with age. 85% among those 50 to 64, 87% among those 65 to 79, and 91% among those 80 years plus. These findings underline a clear reality. Demand for care increases with age. We have a chart about access to healthcare among Canadians aged 50 and older from 2022 to 2025. And this is the percentage who could get the care or services they needed when they needed it over the past 12 months. And we can see that those who got this care all or most of the time, the numbers are pretty low here. So in the 60s in 2022, just kind of grew to 70% in 2025. So it's nice to see this kind of improvement, but those are still remarkably low numbers and I think something to worry about. Then they divided the results by other categories, so by age. Older adults aged 80 plus had the highest success accessing needed care at 85%, followed by those aged 65 to 79 at 76%, while only 61% of those aged 50 to 64 were able to get care when needed. So it's an interesting exercise contemplating why that might be. As we've seen from other sources of information, those between the ages of 50 and 64 are more likely to be working and also possibly having caregiving responsibilities. So could this just be a matter of scheduling, that the hours provided for care don't match up with the schedules or the freedom that these younger people might have. Something to think about. So then by gender, men were slightly more likely than women to report consistent access, 72% versus 68%. What could be happening there? Is it the possibility that men who with female partners, the female partners are more likely to see that they get care? Is there something about ageism in healthcare? I'm sorry, sexism in healthcare at play here? Things to think about. By geography, provincial variation was notable, with access lowest in New Brunswick at 63% and Newfoundland and Labrador 65%, and highest in Saskatchewan 74% and Ontario 73%. So what factors are in play there? And then finally, we have something about people of different ethnicities. So by race and ethnicity, racialized respondents reported lower access at 58% compared with 72% among respondents who identify as white. And clearly those are horrible results. And what kind of things are in play that create more barriers for people who don't identify as white? That's a whole video there. Those in excellent or very good health were more likely to report consistent access, 76%, compared with those in fair or poor health, 65%. So we can see why. It's kind of weird that they phrase it this way. So, yes, people who go to health providers more often are going to be healthier. So, yes. Okay. And then moving on, 78% of those who said their income was good enough to save reported they could access care, compared with 58% of those whose income was not enough and stretched, and 52% of those reporting income not enough and having a hard time. This can become a detrimental cycle whereby those with inadequate incomes have a high risk of experiencing poor health, yet also face barriers to accessing care, which can then exacerbate health challenges and further perpetuate financial insecurity. So, for example, if you do not have access to healthcare providers within your own community, for example, but lack the means to acquire transportation to other locations, right? That's a financial situation that will keep someone from getting the care they need. 63% of those with less than a high school education reported access, compared with 72% of those with a university or graduate education. Why might that be? And here I'm wondering, purely off the top of my head here, would people with less than a high school education be intimidated in any way by someone with a higher level of education? Could people with lower levels of education be treated with some kind of contempt from those who have a higher level of education? In this case, healthcare providers. Just a thought. And then retirees reported better access to needed healthcare than those still in the workforce, 71% versus 65%. This may be due to more flexible schedules among those who are retired, which makes sense. A chart with barriers to healthcare 2025. Top 5 reasons Canadians aged 50 and older could not get all or most of the healthcare services and treatments they needed in 2025. So, by far the biggest problem, 47%, could not get appointments. Why are they not getting appointments? Something we'd like to know about. Difficulty getting a referral. Appointments, treatments, or services were canceled, delayed, or rescheduled. Cost, unable to afford. Service not available in my area. Dementia is a topic I'll be handling with more depth in other videos, but just a little glance here. Approximately 500,000 older adults were diagnosed with dementia in 2023 to 2024, and close to 772,000 Canadians may be living with dementia in 2025. The NIA's 2025 Aging in Canada survey asked older Canadians about their awareness, experiences, and attitudes towards dementia. The results show that although many have been personally affected and feel at ease discussing the illness with healthcare professionals, concerns about dementia prevention remain at the forefront. Nearly two-thirds of older Canadians, 62%, said they had a personal connection to dementia, most often an extended family member, 22%, a parent, 21%, or a friend, 16%. When asked about their ability to reduce their own risk of developing dementia, most Canadians 50 plus, 88%, believe they could influence it to some degree. And a little elaboration would be nice about what people were planning to do in order to lessen the frequency or early onset of dementia. The subject of caregivers is also one I plan on addressing in their own videos. This report touches on it a little bit. So, from the report, 15% of caregivers were working while also taking care of others. Canada is losing $1.3 billion in productivity because of insufficient support for those caregivers. So, for example, a lot of caregivers, as time goes by, they have to cut back on their jobs or have to quit their jobs altogether. And that, of course, has enormous implications for their ability just to manage their own financial lives and save for their own retirement. Okay, caregivers are less likely to access needed health care. Both financial and time constraints play a part. So, talking about access to home and community care. Home and community care are distinct but complementary parts of Canada's care continuum for older adults. Provinces and territories fund these services differently, with home care often subsidized on a needs based and income tested basis, and community supports delivered through a patchwork of provincial territorial programs and local nonprofit organizations. And I think we can see the potential of this being a huge mess. We have all these different parts. How well do they work together? Another chart, this about access to home care and community support services among Canadians aged 50 and older regarding years 2024 and 2025. And I think we can agree these numbers are really bad. So when it comes to people who got home care services all or most of the time, in 2024 it was 48% and only a little increase to 51% in 2025. And then we look at community support services, and in both 2024 and 2025 stuck in the 40 percentage. I think we can agree that this needs drastic improvement in the near future. Direct quote, while there were no major differences with respect to access to community services by gender, a sharp divide emerged in access to home care. Among those who needed home care in 2025, 57% of men reported being able to get the services they needed all or most of the time, compared with 45% of women. This gender gap may reflect the fact that women, who are more likely to live alone and have lower income in later life, face additional challenges in coordinating and affording formal supports. I'm just throwing this idea out there. Those men who got access to these services, were they living alone or were they living with someone else who managed these programs for them? Income adequacy is one of the most powerful predicators of access. Among those with an income good enough to save, 61% said they were able to obtain home care services all or most of the time, while only 26% of those with incomes not enough and having a hard time reported the same, a gap of 35 percentage points. And this is, to me, it's really baffling. And here we have people who are suffering financially. It's like a double hit for them. So they can't afford to buy their own stuff and are having more difficulty getting access to programs. And again, why is that happening? Home care provision also remains uneven across the country. In most provinces and territories, there are publicly funded home care programs that are fully subsidized, meaning clients pay no direct costs, but the range of services remain limited and recipients must qualify. In some jurisdictions, home care operates on an income-based model where some individuals receive care at no cost while others contribute through co-payments based on income. With these variations, access to home care across Canada continues to be constrained by service availability and regional disparities. And I'm not going to go into detail about this particular issue in this video because it's a difficult topic, but there are certain procedures that should be available to people according to law, but people can't access because the right specialists don't operate in their province. And so they would have to go to another province in order to get access, and they might not be able to afford to do so. Wait times were especially high among adults aged 80 and older. Nearly 7 in 10, 69% of whom identified delays as their main barrier. I will be creating other videos where we dive into ageism in the healthcare system. It's pretty much recognized that it's there. And is it possible that as patients get older, they face more intense levels of ageism and therefore they're not a priority? So they have to wait longer for appointments. Is that a possibility? Here's a chart about barriers to home care 2025. So they're giving us some reasons, and some of them we already know, having to wait too long, whether they qualify, but also we have difficulties with people not knowing how to access services. And since more and more things are going online, if there are certain people who just aren't comfortable trying to access the internet, or it is harder and harder to get a real person when you call on the phone, and there's all of these options, press this here, press hit this there, and what if the language is not very intuitive? So it can just make it almost impossible to access these services when you don't even know the language that you should be using to get your information. And then talking about language, just if you go to the very bottom and they talk about language barriers, and this is a situation that can arise when you have an older person who might have immigrated to Canada but was never able to learn French or English. And so accessing services in their language can be extremely difficult. Sometimes people have to rely on their adult children to translate, and here's a potential where the information isn't being relayed properly. Perhaps there could be problems there. And just think about it, even when it comes to prescription bottles, the instructions are going to be in English or French. So that is a real problem that doesn't get enough attention. And we see similar numbers regarding barriers to community support services. Here's a chart about where Canadians aged 50 and older want to live as they age, going from the years 2022 to 2025. And I think these results are interesting. I'd love to see a lot more thought into why they were happening the way that they were. So, of course, to be expected, the majority wanted to remain in their home as long as possible. But what is interesting to me is while there was an increase from 2022 to 2023 and an increase from 2023 to 2024, there's a pretty significant drop between 2024 and 2025. What might have been happening to cause that drop? And then an interesting thing when it comes to downsizing to a similar or more smaller or more manageable home, they practically disappear in 2024. So in the other years, there's a little chunk of people who want to downsize. What happened in 2024 that pretty much erased that goal for so many people? 77% of those aged 50 to 64 said they want to remain in their own home or a smaller one. And it is 85% of those aged 65 to 79 and 87 of those 80 plus. So why is it that the older you get, it seems, the more you want to stay in your own home? Why would younger people say with less frequency, I want to stay in my own home or a smaller one? So do they have future plans maybe where they want to maybe live on cruise ships? Have you heard of those? Where some people are basically living on cruise ships. Who knows? But it is a weird uh, trend, I think. So it would be interesting to know why. And then the report also points out it is important to note that the NIA survey only includes community dwelling older adults and excludes those living in long term care homes, which may impact overall findings. Because one thing to think about when someone ends up living in a long-term care facility, it's usually not because they want to be there, right? So throughout their life, they went from a housing situation where they had privacy and control over their own schedule and their possessions. And then over time, their home environment shrank to possibly just one room in a long-term care facility where you have few of your possessions about and your schedule is controlled by other people, when you get up, when you can eat, all that sort of thing. So yes, I imagine there would be very different results if these people were included in the survey. Another Result that seems a bit weird to me. In 2025, 85% of those in excellent or very good health said they wanted to remain in their home or a smaller one for as long as they can, compared with only 76% of those in fair or poor health. Uncertainty was also more common among those in poor health, with 11% saying it was too early to know, compared with 8% among those in better health. Oh, would I love some more detail as to why they have these differences? Why does health have this kind of impact? Wouldn't everyone like to stay in their own home? Or is it a situation where we've kind of been tying together health and income? With those who are of more poor health, who also might have lower income, what kind of housing do they have? Maybe it's a kind of housing where they don't want to stay and hope for something better in the future. Just putting that out there. And here the report does touch on the impact of income. Canadians who described their income as good enough to save were much more likely to want to remain in their home, or a smaller one at 88%, than those who said their income was not enough and stretched 73%. Among those reporting their income was not enough and having a hard time, just 65% expressed a preference to remain at home for as long as they can. Uncertainty was highest among those with inadequate incomes, with 18% saying it was too early to know. This is a chart about percentage of Canadians aged 50 and older with homes suitable to age in place 2025. And a lot of people don't really think that far ahead. And a lot of people are thinking, yep, I can do everything I need my entire life. So, does the home have a lot of stairs that might cause problems as people age? Are the doors wide enough to accommodate a walker or a wheelchair? What kind of bathing facilities do they have? Is it something easily stepped into, or do people have to step over a pretty high barrier to get into the bathtub? So some things that actually you can get advice about. There's lots of articles out there about how to make your home more friendly as you age, dealing with carpets, stuff like that. So of those respondents, 49% felt their home was fully suitable, and then 45% suitable for now, may not be in the future. But it's good that they're thinking about it. Here they touch a little bit on the differences between those who own their home and those who rent. To be honest, I find some of these statistics don't seem to line up with earlier statistics, but we're just going to go with what they say here. In 2025, 90% of homeowners aged 50 plus said they wanted to remain in their home or a smaller one for as long as they can age, compared with only 65% of renters. Homeowners often have a greater sense of stability, equity, and control over their environment, while renters may face insecurity around affordability, lease renewals, or the physical suitability of rental housing for aging related needs. So, renters, by the way, they can't just make random changes to their environment to make it easier to age in, like changing the bathtub, lowering cabinets, stuff like that. But they also do have that lack of security. Will I be able to stay in this my home 1 year to the next? Because sorry to show my bias, but in Ontario, homes that rental accommodation that started kind of kicking in became becoming into effect from 2018 and onward, even though a tenant might be continuing to stay in an apartment from 1 year to the next, landlords have the ability after that first year to increase the amount of rent by however much they want. So, people with a fixed income, can they ever feel like they're in a home if at the end of that year they have no idea how much the increase will be? How can they plan? And to me, this is a very serious issue that we should be addressing and changing. But this is where we are right now. Here's a chart for preparations for aging in place among Canadians aged 50 and older, 2025. And fairly low amount, 18% have set aside savings for future in-home care or renovations. That's not necessarily a lack of planning. It could be lack of resources, right? We have people who are barely getting by paycheck to paycheck. They really don't have the money to set aside for this kind of thing. And then we also have 18% installed safety features, grab bars, ramps, what have you. Again, we have an affordability issue. That kind of stuff tends to be very expensive. And then downsized, made a plan, arranged, The bottom 62% have not taken any steps yet. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. Again, we're talking about income, but we also have a resistance that a lot of people have to acknowledging that as they get older, they might have more needs. And, we see this in a lot of areas where people don't want to make plans because it seems too grim. So people who will not create a power of attorney, will not put together a will, and it shows up in other areas as well, not necessarily health related, because there's a situation when it comes to small businesses and the people who made the business, they want to hand it down maybe to their kids, but they've made absolutely no plans for that process. So when it happens, it's a huge mess. But yeah, we have a lot of people who are going to get some nasty shocks, and it could be because of money, it could be because of attitude, and that's another thing that we should be encouraging changes about. And here we have a chart about feelings about the prospect or experience of aging among older Canadians aged 50 and older from 2022 to 2025. And here we have some disappointing results where positive feelings have declined from 2022 to 2025. Negative feelings have increased from 2022 to 2025. So, what could be the reasons behind this? And here we have results divided according to age. So, positive feelings about getting older by age, 2025. And again, we see this disturbing trend pretty much across the board. In 2025, there was a decrease in positive feelings. And the exception being the age 65 to 69, it's stayed consistent between 2024 and 2025. So again, it's interesting to speculate, why are these drops happening? What's going on in our context that is making older people feel that life isn't as good for them as it was just a couple of years ago? The report touches on the impact of feeling in control. And I think we can appreciate that your health and level of income or other financial issues will have an impact on whether you do feel in control. Obviously, if you're stressed out all the time about your health or income, it makes it harder to deal with new problems. When you are confident with your finances, a new problem crops up. Okay, this is like an exception. How can I deal with it? As opposed to being yet another financial situation that makes it more difficult to get through 1 month to the next. And the same with health. If you're generally in good health, you're in a better mindset to say, okay, here's this new thing happening. How can I address it? As opposed to always having difficulty with health and yet another issue that could be overwhelming. So, when asked, to what extent do you feel in control of how you will age, older Canadians told us that health was a critical factor. 89% of those in excellent or very good health felt at least somewhat in control, compared with only 41% of those in fair or poor health. Many view control as being directly shaped by access to resources, support services, and the design of care systems. When health systems offer person-centered, integrated care, feelings of agency and confidence are notably higher. And this is something I will address with more depth in another video involving ageism in healthcare. But it is a unfortunate reality that sometimes when an older patient is accompanied by their adult child, the healthcare provider kind of ignores the patient and talks directly to the adult child. And this is first of all, you're not getting the information from the right person, but you're locking out the most important person from this conversation. So this older person is going to feel invisible, as well as failing to have the kind of control over their own process that they should have. So here we have a chart, perspectives on how society views older adults 2025. Now remember, this is information coming from older adults and how they feel society perceives or treats older people. So is this something similar that other younger people might agree with or not? Now, unfortunately, the by far biggest amount, almost half, 47%, feel that older adults are sometimes overlooked or dismissed. And I don't think we can disagree with that. Uh, and then, kind of a depressingly low amount feels that older adults are generally respected and valued. And what I would like to see here is if there is a difference regarding different cultures. Are some older people treated with more respect in some cultures over others? So to me, that would be an interesting area of research. Possibly I'll do a video about it in the future. The last bit to this video, beyond these personal factors, so health, income, control, external influences such as economic or political factors may also be impacting perceptions of aging and confidence in the future. Now, as an extreme example of this, going back a few years when COVID first came out, that we were recognizing it came out and seeing all this damage, it was perceived as an older person's disease. And that played out in a lot of ways. So, first of all, we had a lot of terrible rhetoric about, hey, yeah, we should let this disease, thin out the older population. And that was obviously horrible. But we had ageism popping up in other areas. So, we had adult children trying to control what their parents did. And we had older people who did seem to be taking some risks, but should they be given the right to do so? I mean, if they are capable of making their own decisions, that includes bad decisions. And then the impacts of isolation. Did it have a harsher impact on older people? We do have horrible stories of older people being in a hospital without being able to have visitors, things of that sort. So, this is something that was beyond everyone's control. How did we treat this event and how did we treat older people? So, just something to think about. Are there more recent events that are causing this increased perception that older people are not being treated very well? And that is the end of this video. If you got to the end of that, I appreciate it, and I hope you found something interesting from it. Have a great day.